My subscription ran out. I did not get hounded with 100 notices. It just ran out, and it was up to me to be responsible. So I would like you to please welcome Frank Joseph.
I understand I'm given 90 minutes to talk. I wouldn't listen to anybody for 90 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'll break the first half up, first part. Mercifully, the shorter part will be my presentation, and the rest will be slides, which I'm sure will do a far better job than I can do. So I guess the best way to begin is just to address you as my fellow Atlanteans and Lemurians and others. Americans suffer from historical amnesia. And like all amnesia victims are easily controlled because their own sense of identity is very poor. What if somebody could deprive you of all personal knowledge of your life up until the last 2 weeks? You only knew about yourself, say, the beginning of August or the end of July. Why, you would feel very disoriented, and you would not be able to make proper decisions regarding your future. Your own sense of self-identity would be diminished. And the same thing applies not only to individuals, but also to societies and to whole nations. And it is possible that the United States is in a similar condition of historical amnesia. An example of that is something called the ancient copper trade, which probably most of you have never heard of. 3000 BC, 3,000 years before Christ, 5,000 years ago. It's a very hard concept, really, for us to understand what was going on at that time, how long ago that was in historical time. 3,000 years before Christ is the official beginning of dynastic Egypt. Egypt was new. Civilization in Mesopotamia amongst the Sumerians was relatively new. This is the very beginnings of civilized life. What was going on here in North America at that time? Well, the conventional or mainstream archaeologists will say, and they're right, that about 5,000 or more years ago, the indigenous population was rather low, was composed mostly of what we call Paleo-Indians or Archeo-Indians. These were the predecessors of the modern-day Plains Indians, who were involved in a very primitive and low level of culture, material culture, known as the hunter-gatherer. And they used copper, known as float copper, left behind by the glacier, little nodules. And they would pick up pieces of copper and they'd bang them into ornaments. And that's all. But 5,000 years ago, 3,000 or 3,100 BC, a very peculiar thing happened in a part of North America that we now refer to as Upper Michigan. Between that time period of 3,000 BC and 1,200 BC, over that period of time, a bare minimum, an unrealistic minimum of 500 million pounds of the world's highest grade copper was extracted in highly sophisticated mining techniques. And that 500 million pounds of copper has now been upscaled by those in the know to be possibly 3 times that amount. Who could have removed such prodigious amounts of copper, and why? Did they leave any evidence behind? They left literally tons of evidence behind. For example, we know that through the one area where it was mostly mined, in a place called the Kewaunee Peninsula of Upper Michigan, the mines extended for more than 150 miles. In Isle Royale, which is in Lake Superior, where the second greatest amount of copper was extracted, the mines still exist. You can go there today. They are part of an archaeological park. These mines, if they were all strung together, would form a trench more than 5 miles long, 20 feet across, and an average depth of 30 feet. In fact, there are over 5,000 of these ancient mines. These mines were not dug horizontally or at an angle. They were dug straight down vertically, sometimes more than 60 feet through solid rock to remove the copper. At the bottom of some of these shafts have been found and still preserved, like in the Ontonagon Museum of Michigan, machines that were left behind, machines that resemble car jacks. They are known as crib work. And at the bottom of one of these shafts was found a crib work, and sitting on top of it was a 60-ton nugget of pure copper, high-grade copper. The amount of tools that have been found that these ancient miners used extends literally into the millions. In 1840 alone, 10 cartloads of these hammer stones were carted away and used from the mines and used for fill in modern-day building, 19th century building. And these stone tools comprised beautifully engineered hammerheads, hammerstones. Some of them weighed only 2.5 pounds for working off spars, and others weighed over 40 pounds, as much as almost 50 pounds. They were tied to sinew, attached to the rafters in the mine shaft, and then would batter the face of the pit mine to remove the copper. Now, the question, of course, is, well, if the Indians were not doing this, well, then who was? Who was extracting all of this? When you think, for example, that each one of these pit mines, on an average, had 1,000 pounds of copper removed, and that the techniques used are still in existence, how they did extract this copper. For example, what they would do, these ancient miners, when they found a copper mine, they would heat it with acetylene temperatures. No one knows how they arrived at these high temperatures. And as the temperatures reached these high levels, they would throw a mixture of water and vinegar onto the rock. The rock would split, exposing the copper, which was then removed. This is only one example of an American mystery which has been almost completely neglected in our schools, not taught in any of our schools. It's not discussed on television. And yet it is something of extreme historical importance, because the Indians, the descendants of the Indians of that time, do not claim that they were the miners. The Menominee Indians, who are the descendants of the Paleo Indians who lived in that area, say that these mines were built by what they call the marine men, or the sea people. And they describe them as light-skinned foreigners who came across in large canoes, who committed great sin by wounding Mother Earth to extract her shiny bones. Yet, we don't hear anything about that. It's not the only example of how our history is suppressed. Certain aspects of our history are suppressed. For example, there's something in Minnesota called the Kensington Rune Stone, which was found a little more than 100 years ago in north-central Minnesota. And on this gray-whack granite slab was found a runic inscription which told about Scandinavian voyagers who came to America 140 years before Columbus set sail. When this stone was first found, it was found by a common farmer. He was ridiculed to the extent that his daughter committed suicide, and that stone today is still regarded as just a piece of fraudulent, artifactual attempt at swindling the general public. And yet 5 years ago, this top state geologist of Minnesota, also chief linguist for Massachusetts, proved that the internal evidence of the stone shows that it was indeed written in the early part of the 14th century AD. Yet we hear nothing from establishment archaeologists saying that Columbus was not the first, that obviously here is hard physical evidence to show that a team of Scandinavians arrived in Minnesota in the early part of the 14th century. That is not the only other example. About 25 years ago, a Roman shipwreck was found off the coast of Brazil by an American archaeologist, Robert Marks. The ship itself was identified as a Roman freighter because of the cargo, which was still intact. The cargo included a number of jars which contained olive oil. He took one of the jars and sent it to the University of Maryland. The jar and its contents were firmly dated beyond any debate to 41 AD, belonged to a Roman freighter. This made such an uproar in Brazil, although virtually nothing got into any of the mainstream press about this find, made such an uproar in Brazil that the Catholic Church put tremendous pressure on the Brazilian Navy. The Brazilian Navy then went out over the Roman site, the Roman wreck, and dumped a cement barge over it so that no one has any further access to that site. And the reason why is because in South America, Christopher Columbus has achieved a kind of sainthood, and therefore to suggest that Columbus was not driven by God to discover the Americas for the Catholic Church is to undermine church doctrine. That still is not the only example. In the early part of the 1840s, the very first pioneers were coming across Michigan. These were simple farmers and pioneers, and they came across Indian mounds that are found everywhere, earthen mounds. These, however, were a little bit different than those found elsewhere. When the farmers dug into these mounds to clear their lands for farmland and for agricultural purposes, they found inside not just one mound, not just hundreds of mounds, but literally thousands of mounds, slate tablets. And on these slate tablets were inscribed like a teaching guides in a hieroglyphic language. And accompanying this unknown language were illustrations, simple grammar school type illustrations from Genesis and from the Old Testament. Literally 7,000 or 5,000 of these tablets were unearthed by farmers, sometimes under conditions where the archaeologists were on hand to see them being excavated from the mounds. Many times when the excavations were done, they were in the company of notary republics, so they were verified as authentically being removed from these mounds. The uproar from the archaeological establishment in the early part of the 20th century was so great, and the condemnation, the number one focus of the archaeologists in the early part of the 20th century was so vituperative that all of the university collections, which had thousands of these tablets, affirming that a Christian community had been established probably in the early part of the 5th century AD in Michigan, so much pressure was brought to bear on these university collections that those collections were mostly destroyed or sold to private investors. And therefore, only a few collectors have these tablets today. Now, this I'm talking about is a long time ago, the 19th century and the 20th century. We can come up to our own time. Not too many years ago, about 10 years ago, a skeleton was found in a place called Kennewick, Washington. And this skeleton was very unusual because it was and is the oldest known complete human skeleton ever found in North America. Trouble is, it is not of an Indian. It is of a Caucasian man who had been violently killed. When the find of the Kennewick man was first made, the local Indian tribe claimed it for their own because they said anything which is found that predates Columbus is automatically ours. However, some other Indian tribes came in at that time and said, no, we have traditions of other peoples, foreigners who also came in here. That's their heritage, not ours. So a debate, a controversy erupted in the Indian community themselves. And it looked for a time as though the anthropologists would have a chance to study this incredibly rare find that puts a Caucasian man in the state of Washington 9,000 to 11,000 years ago. When things looked like they were about to be resolved, the Army Corps of Engineers came in, the federal government, and said, no, it is impossible that any remains that are found that predate the 15th century could be anything other than Indian. And so now there is a prolonged court case that has been going on for some years. And during all that time, of course, the real study that needs to be done on the Kennewick man's remains is not being done. In Mexico, I'll give you one more example. There are numerous examples. I go on for days, but there's another one. If you go to standard textbooks on the history of the Americas, they will tell you that at the very earliest, human beings were in the Americas 30,000 years ago, and they reached Mexico, Middle America, maybe 15, 20,000 years ago, and that's it. This has been taught as dogma everywhere you go. All the university circuits will tell you that. About 25 years ago, a trained archaeologist, Virginia Steen McIntyre, trained archaeologist, certified archaeologist for years, highly respected in her field, was at work at a site in central Mexico. And they found some human remains. And at first, the human remains tested very, very old, to about 22,000 years ago. Well, that's quite a find. That's pretty much within the parameters of the textbooks. However, Virginia Steen McIntyre, in addition to her credentials as a superb archaeologist, is also a highly qualified geologist. And the geological dating was much older. She did not trust even her own expertise, so she called in her colleagues. She called in United States colleagues and Mexican colleagues, geologists, not archaeologists. And they determined beyond a shadow of a doubt that these human remains, between 4 and 5 people that were living in central Mexico, fully developed human beings, dated back 250,000 years ago. Now, this is not theory. This is not my interpretation. What I have given you are all solid, absolute, unequivocal facts. Now, why is it we don't hear about this? And what is the response of the scholastic establishment to all this? Well, in the case of the mines, the ancient copper mines, they will say, yes, there are copper mines. We can't deny it. They're there. But the Indians must have made them, the Archeo-Indians. But the Archeo-Indians, whose descendants are still living today, say that they did not build them. And we know for a fact that the Indians at that time were at a very low material level of society, who were not interested in mining. They were always on the move. They followed the seasons. One of the things they found up at Isle Royale, where all the copper mining took place, is a kind of a hint of what was involved here. No graves were found in Isle Royale, Upper Michigan, of these ancient copper miners. Nothing like that. But they did find a harbor works, a kind of a jetty, which is half a mile long. Now, you don't need a harbor works half a mile long for a birch bark canoe. But the establishment will still say, the Indians must have done it. Well, the Kensington runestone has been absolutely authenticated as belonging to the early part of the 14th century. There were Scandinavians here, Christian Vikings in Minnesota, 130 years before Columbus even was born. But the Kensington runestone is a fake. It's a fraud. But will they explain why it's a fake? Why it's a fraud? No. Nothing was before Columbus, so anything you say is before Columbus, ipso facto, is fraudulent. Well, what about that Roman wreck? I told you what they did. They actually had a barge from the Brazilian Navy drop a concrete slabs over the site. What an extreme measure to do. I mean, when we first started our magazine, Ancient American, and boy, did we try to get the idea that it's possible that people from other parts of the world visited the Americas before Columbus, people got very angry at us, violently angry at us. And we used to always say, it's only archaeology. But it's more than archaeology. And I will tell you why it's more than archaeology. The same people that have been telling you consistently the same paradigm, nobody here before Columbus, only Indians here at the time, are because these are the teachers, the professors, who write the textbooks that are bought consistently by their students. So if you come up in the class and say, well, I'm sorry, professor, but there's evidence to show that the Kensington runestone is beyond question of a doubt. It definitely shows there were people here, not by accident, but more than just one person here before Columbus. Well, what does that do? It undermines his credibility. His textbook is useless. He can't teach. He can't sell his textbooks to his students anymore. That's just one, though. The other thing that we found out is that when you go to school to become an archaeologist, and this you don't hear much of all, but when you do, and it takes a long time, it's hard study, a lot of money, and you graduate, well, then the good old boys come around, and they say, well, congratulations, you're part of the club now. and we're going to support your research, whatever you do. But we expect you to support our research. And if you don't, you're out. I don't care what kind of credentials you have. And as an example of that is Virginia Steen McGintyre, who I told you about, found that 250,000-old human remains in Mexico. They ruined her career. She is no longer an archaeologist. They drummed her out of the profession. How can they do that? She had tenure. She had respect. She graduated from school. She had everything that they had. Yet they closed off all of their symposia to her. None of her articles could get published in for anything in peer review. She could teach nowhere, and so her economic basis was cut out from under her, and she is no longer a serving professional archaeologist. That's what they'll do to you. Another example is a fellow who you may have heard of, some of you may have. His name is Michael Coe. And Michael Coe is the doyen of Mexican studies, a United States citizen, but he spent most of his life in Mexico. And he found the Olmecs. He gave them that name, the oldest known people in the Americas. And after he retired, he came out publicly and said, there are definitely influences in prehistoric America from other parts of the world. I can say that now because I'm retired. But if I had said at the beginning of my career, I would have never made it this far. What an admission to make. Why is this being done? Just for the textbooks? Well, it's part of it. Just to support each other in the good old boy club? Well, that's part of it too. But the main reason is something called linear history. The doctrine of linear history. Well, what does that mean? Linear history means, and this is the establishment idea, that we, the United States, Western civilization, are the epitome of everything that's come before. And it's slowly from everything before us is primitive, has worked its way up until we are the expression, the absolute zenith of human accomplishment. And that all these others that have come up, well, they've done important things, but really they're just contributed to what we are. Well, if you come along and you say, well, it looks as though other civilizations have come and gone and come and gone, and that some of those civilizations have made the same mistakes that this civilization is making, what do? You undercut the premise of the linear history. That's what these other finds indicate, that there were other peoples who reached high levels of society and lost it, everything. And they did mistakes that were very similar to what we're doing. So the teachers and the textbook writers, where do they get their money? They get their money from grants. They get their money from the U.S. government. And so therefore, you can say that I'm teaching history to support all this. Isn't it wonderful? Well, it's just like you may have read a book called 1984 by George Orwell. And what does he say in that? He says that he who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future. And that is why history is important. It's not just a collection of tales of a bunch of dead old guys. History is not something that happened then. The present isn't something now, and the future is something going to happen. It's one unified energy flow. And if you pinch off one aspect of it, the rest of you suffers. Now, the worst thing that you can say to these people is not about the Kensington runestone, which is a fraud and a fake, but the thing that drives them crazy is the A word, and that is Atlantis, which I can say here. But I can't say many other places because it can get dangerous to your health. Well, what is it? What was Atlantis? Was it just a fable, just a myth, just a story, or worse? Was Plato just a liar, made it up? Well, let's go back I'll give you a little proof here about those mines. Those mines really existed, folks. They really did remove 500 million pounds of copper minimum, probably 3 times that amount. They were sophisticated miners. Whoever these people were, and they came in, they got their copper ore out by the tens of thousands of tons, and they took off. And you know what? That copper has never been retrieved. It vanished. There's no accounting for it. It's gone. What happened? Well, the Indians, they just disposed of 500 million pounds of copper somehow? Doesn't seem likely. Well, Plato, long time ago, 2,300 years ago, talked about a place called Atlantis. And he said that the people who lived in Atlantis were remarkable for two things. One, they were great seafarers. They went everywhere. And number two, they built their wealth on what? Copper. High-grade copper, which he called orichalcum. Translation of orichalcum from the Greek means just a very high grade of copper. Okay, that's interesting. Was there something that can maybe parallel that? Yes, indeed there is. Remember those dates that I told you for the mining of the ancient copper, which are firm dates, by the way. 3000 BC to 1200 BC. All of a sudden, 3000 BC, boom, copper mining just erupted. All of a sudden, the Indians decided they could dig down through 60 feet of solid stone, and they had all these ways of removing the copper. And then 1200 BC, it abruptly stopped. Well, what do we find about those dates in other parts of the world? 3000 BC in Europe is the beginning of something called the Bronze Age. Now, what do you need to make bronze? You don't dig it out of the ground. If you don't have bronze, what have you got? You got copper, which is okay, but it can't stand up against a bronze weapon. And you got stone. Bronze is made of three things. It's made of copper, zinc, and tin. And in Europe, oh, they had lots of zinc, they had some tin, and their copper was of a poor quality, not that good. For example, the copper mines in Egypt were pretty well mined out early on. In the island of Cyprus, for example, where most of the copper came from, it means, in Assyrian, copper. It comes from the word kippur. If you had a bronze weapon, an army that was equipped with bronze weaponry, you had, it was the equivalent today of nuclear fission. Without it, you were not one of the big powers. 3000 BC to 1200 BC is when the mining is going on here in North America. Furious, large-scale mining of 500 million pounds, which vanished. The other side of the world, in Europe, the Bronze Age erupts 3000 BC, and the Bronze Age ends 1200 BC, abruptly ends at that time. Circumstantial evidence. In between Europe and North America, you have what Plato described as Atlantis, home of a people who were the great seafarers, the great brokers of high-grade copper. And we now know, and I know this is controversial amongst many of my friends, but I've been working on this for some time with my colleagues, we now know that the date for the final destruction of Atlantis, and Atlantis, because of its location in a seismically unstable area, went through many epochs of upheaval, but its final destruction, its most violent aspect, took place in November of 1198 BC, right around 1200 BC. So here we have what we feel is the final date for the destruction of Atlantis, 1200 BC, the end of the copper mining abruptly in North America, 1200 BC, and the end of the Bronze Age abruptly in 1200 BC. This is a comparison which mainstream archaeologists, conventional archaeologists won't even consider, because Atlantis to them is heresy. And the reason why Atlantis is heresy is not just because it flies in the face of their accepted ideas, but because of someone else that I have to mention to you, and that is a man called Edgar Cayce. For those of you who are not familiar with that name, I presume you all are, he's known as the sleeping prophet of the 20th century. I don't intend to give you a long biography of him, but it is important to mention a couple things. First of all, he was a rather simple man, certainly not a highly educated man, but a very good-hearted man, which is far more important. And when he was very young, he underwent a very traumatic experience. He was almost killed in a death-dealing disease, illness that he suffered. So out of this near-death experience, he came forth transformed. He would fall into a sleep, kind of a trance, and say things that he had no recollection of after he came conscious again. Mostly, for some years, he prescribed medical cures for people, which are still used today. Remarkable cures. Many of them still work. Just give you one example. I don't want to overstay my time. I should just give you this one example I've also as remarkable. There's a story in 1922 of a woman, by this time his reputation had been established, a woman in Chicago who had a very severe rash on her left arm. And all the doctors could not cure it, didn't understand what was causing this very severe rash. He never met the woman. He, of course, was out in Virginia at that time. And he went into his trance-like sleep, and he came out of it, and his secretary, Gladys, told him that he had said that there's a little spider hiding behind the medicine cabinet in this woman's room, and that when she reaches the medicine cabinet, the spider runs out and bites her and causes this. So they went to a medicine cabinet, and there was what is known as a recluse spider, which is a very dangerous spider. And the spider was captured, and the toxin fit exactly to the problem that she was experiencing in her arm. That just gives you one of thousands of examples. Well, after he had been giving this medical advice for about 20 years, somebody said, well, you know, I keep having these recurring stomach aches all the time. Is there any past life cause for this? And Cayce says, well, sure, when you were in Atlantis, you caused all these problems and all this stuff, and now you're doing that. And so when he woke up, he says, Atlantis, what's that? Where's that? Did I mean Atlanta, Georgia? He was that ignorant of this whole idea of Atlantis. So over the course of time, he spoke more and more about people who had lived in previous incarnations in this lost island civilization. And by the time of his death in 1945, he had said a lot about this land and what it was like. And it's interesting to compare Cayce's statements about what life was like in Atlantis with what Plato and others have said about it. And rather than contradicting anything that others have said, except perhaps in the date parameters, it's extremely complementary. And the reason I mention Cayce here in connection with what I told you before is because Cayce unknowingly really put his finger on why Atlantis is heresy. Because Cayce describes, first of all, a very beautiful mountainous land. It was the first place where human beings learned to make the transition from barbarism to civilization. And the reason why they went to this particular island to do it is because it was a temperate island that was at one time connected to Africa and Southwest Europe by land bridges. They were merely following animal herds into this land. Over time, these land bridges collapsed into the sea. Human beings that were left on this island were able to grow crops twice a year because of its temperate climate and also because of its very rich volcanic soil. And so Cayce says that on Atlantis, the people evolved not only an early civilization, very long time ago, but that it lasted a long time. So in the course of many, many centuries, you have time to accumulate a great deal of wisdom. And so they evolved a high-level spirituality that is the forerunners of our modern religions today. And they also developed a very high-level technology, which was not like ours. They didn't have jet airplanes, and they didn't have refrigerators and computers in the sense that we have them here, but they used a technology based on strict observance of the laws of nature. Our society is Newtonian. Our society is based on mechanics. Theirs is based on natural rhythms. And it is from that observation that their Atlantean science developed. And they worked a lot with crystals because crystals, as we now know, with the piezoelectric effect and the old crystal radio sets, what do crystals do? Crystals are not magic in themselves. They're just minerals, but they assume magical properties when they're in contact with human beings. Why? Because your individual bodies generate tremendous amounts of electricity. I don't even know how much electricity your brain and your heart and your muscles produce. By having a crystal in close contact with you, physical contact with you, it magnifies these energies, and if used properly, can concentrate those energies. So Cayce's Atlantis, as he portrays it, was a land of enormous spiritual and technological advances. And the people were achieving almost godhood. They were a very virtuous people. They traveled everywhere. They brought their wisdom and their ideologies to other lands. In Egypt, for an example, they didn't conquer the land and they didn't try to lord it over the native peoples. They tried to work in harmony with them. And supposedly, according to Cayce, the Great Pyramid that we just learned a little bit about earlier was an expression of the labor that was used by the people that lived along the Nile Valley, and the expertise that had been developed over many centuries, perhaps even thousands of years, in old Atlantis to build the Great Pyramid, for reasons that I completely agree with in our last speaker. However, over time, the Atlanteans found that they could barter their knowledge, and more than knowledge. The copper mining is part of that. And by degrees, they became less interested in spirituality than in material gain, until a new and deplorable spirituality began to evolve. The Atlanteans understood, as Cayce said, that the highest power of the universe is not electricity or atomic power. The greatest power in the universe, once harnessed, is spiritual power. And the Atlanteans understood that and were harnessing spiritual or psychic powers to do things that we're just beginning to grasp. And their spirituality developed into something called the Sons of Belial. Belial was their concept of the sun. Now, they didn't worship the sun, they used that as a symbol, the all-conquering sun. And it was a religion, a kind of a satanic religion, which deified greed, deified materialism, justified selfishness. And in this deification of greed became an obsession with technology, in which spiritual concepts were degraded more and more over time. Gadgets, things, toys, power, control, those were the tenets of the Sons of Belial. In opposition to them rose something called the followers of the law of one, which was actually an older idea, as a kind of a monotheistic idea, a proto-Christian idea, if you will, which opposed this rampant materialism. And so a religious schism verging on war almost took place in Atlantis. The old religions distanced themselves from this religious struggle. The oldest religion on Atlantis was known as the navel of the world. The navel of the world meaning the womb and tomb from which all life springs, the symbol of the egg, of the cosmic egg, the initiation rites of Elysium, or our concept today of the chakras. All this goes back to this old navel of the world idea, which survived in part to influence other parts of the world. But in the last days of Atlantis, there was tension and conflict between this deification of greed, known as the Sons of Belial, and this reactionary proto-Christian idea known as the followers of the law of one. The great power center of Atlantis shifted eventually to the Sons of Belial. By that time, Atlantean technology had reached levels that we don't even suspect today. But part of that technology has left itself in the records of other peoples. And that is that somehow Atlantean technology afforded its masters control of the life forces of the planet itself. They dabbled with what they should have never touched, the sacred power of the earth. And by doing that, they disrupted the relationship of the earth to this disease now crawling over the planet of the earth called mankind, and violent seismic activity was the result. And Atlantis was utterly annihilated, the vast overwhelming majority of its people destroyed. It became not just an event in history, like Pompeii, it seared itself as a genetic trauma that we all carry. And it explains why Cayce said that beginning in the 20th century, more Atlantean souls than ever before were reincarnating. Some of them to absolutely deny that such a thing ever happened because they were involved in its destruction, and others who remember the better parts of it and want to learn the ultimate lesson of Atlantis. And that is why, on a subliminal level, there is so much hostility just to the concept of Atlantis, because the parallels are too close to what our Western civilization is now doing to the planet, which is also leading to possibly a catastrophe. You may have heard of something called the Aztec calendar stone, or the Maya calendar, which says that on the vernal equinox of the year 2012, there will be the end of one age and the beginning of another. And the Mayas and the Aztecs, of course, a later expression of the Mayas, said that these ages in between always are marked by world-class catastrophes or cataclysms. And it's interesting that the Aztecs told their Spanish conquerors that of the four past ages, the world had been almost destroyed by what looked like a comet or a meteor, had been destroyed by major flooding, and they'd given specific names for these ages. And so the Spanish asked them, now 500 years ago, well, what is this great change of the age that will take place in the year 2012? What do you call that? They said, well, that one is going to be known as the rebellion of the earth. Now, this was stated to the conquistadors back in the early part of the 16th century. It sounds like an ecological event on the horizon. Well, I think that I'm going to just conclude this here and go on with my slides. They will give you a more specific picture of what I hope was Atlantis in its last years. The focus of my research for the past 22 years has been on the final aspects of Atlantis and not its beginnings. The reason why is because Atlantis, as Cayce said, was very, very old, and we don't have much information on going back 40,000 years or so. There is some, but not very much. But we do have a lot of information going back to only 3,200 years ago, which looks like that was the final gasp of Atlantean civilization, the final catastrophe. And so that's been pretty much the focus of my work. So I'll begin with the slides. I don't have that much time, so I'll do the slides. If you have any questions, you can come to my workshop, which is, I believe, at 7 o'clock. I'll be glad to answer questions. I'm going to be speaking on a different subject, synchronicity or meaningful coincidence, which is, believe it or not, not unrelated to this. And I'll begin with the slides now. My magic box. Can you hear me? It's okay? I do? Oh, thank you. This is the near Atlantic, as it is known. Here we have Spain, Portugal, Morocco, North Africa, the Canary Islands, Madeira Islands, the Azore Islands. According to Plato, the Straits of Gibraltar here were known in his time as the Pillars of Hercules. According to Plato, Atlantis was in the near Atlantic. The reason why, even though I know Atlantis has been found all over the world, it's been found in Sweden and the Bahamas and every place else, and I'm not denigrating researchers who are finding Atlantean remains in other parts of the world. Those, I believe, are outposts or colonies of Atlantis in its imperial period. But we must look for Atlantis in this area because Plato says that the Atlanteans in their final degraded stage, when they were more interested in militarism than spirituality, were involved in wars on the European and North African continent. And it's very difficult to conduct a war, even in these days, from a place like Cuba or the Bahamas. This is probably what Atlantis looked like. This is a model of the Canary Island of Tenerife off the coast of North Africa. The reason why is because there is a certain morphology that oceanographers have found a similarity in all of the islands in the Atlantic Ocean. They are all basically volcanic with a central mountain. Plato describes Atlantis as being a city on the south end of the main mountain, which was known as Atlas, Mount Atlas. It is a Sanskrit word meaning he who upholds. And the reason why he was associated with this great mountain was because Atlas in Atlantean and later Greek mythology was the founder of astronomy and astrology. Today, those two concepts are at loggerheads. In the beginning, one was only an expression of the other. Probably astronomy came first, natural observation of the heavens, and then parallels between what was seen above and below were made, and that is astrology. But in any case, Atlas was considered the mythic founder of astrology and astronomy, which was part of the old Atlantean religion of the navel of the world. Let's see here. Go back. Oh, my slides are not working, unfortunately. There we go. This is that same island, or this is a photograph taken from the ferry boat that runs from Spain to the Canary Islands. And this helps to explain why the mythic image was associated with the mountain. Atlas, as I said, is considered the upholder of the heavens. He's not holding up the world as is commonly portrayed. He's not holding up the earth. That is a modern misconception. He's always portrayed as holding up the sky or holding up the sphere of the zodiac. So here we would see the great mountain of Atlas, just like the mountain of, this is called Mount Teide in the Canary Islands, the same thing. On a day of low overcast, which is very common, it looks as though the mountain is holding up the sky. So the same mythic images work there. Let's see. There we go. This is to give you some idea of what Atlantis looked like. It was an unusual place, an unusual city. It was built of concentric walls. 5 and 6 were the sacred numerals of Atlantis, Plato tells us, to honor the odd and even. In other words, to honor both sides of nature, the male and feminine energies of nature. So it was made of concentric rings of alternating land and water, bisected by canals. This was probably an outgrowth of a very early Neolithic site. You've seen places like Stonehenge or Avebury in England. They're all circular and concentric. Probably Atlantis began as a Neolithic or late Stone Age settlement, which as it grew over time was built on its own foundations to create a kind of a circular structure. I'm sorry that my projector is not working the way it should. There. And as seen above, it would look similar. This is, of course, almost a cartoon of what it would look like. You have these canals of water, rings of water, and land, bisected by several canals. This is just one. This is done for military purposes, for defense, to mobilize. So in other words, the Atlantis that we're looking at here, as described by Plato, is in its last phase as a military giant, an empire, imperial enterprise, culturally very advanced, but also decadent and on its way out. The outside ring here, this was a race course. It was open to the general public for public demonstrations, also for military parades, for religious parades. This ring here was for the aristocracy, for the movers and shakers of society, the admirals, the generals, the priests. The center island, the smallest of them all, was for the emperor and the emperor's family alone. Also had something there called the Temple of Poseidon. Now, Atlantean society began as really rather free and open, and some of that persisted even to the end. None of these rings were entirely off limits to the common people. On certain holidays, certain sacred days, they were allowed to go to the inner island and visit with, not the emperor himself, but visit the Temple of Poseidon. So some of these ideas strike us as rather modern. If I can. Now, the citadel of Atlantis probably resembled this. Now, this is not Atlantis. This is a better known place to let the archaeologists are not ashamed to talk about, although they're a little queasy on this too. This is Troy, or the capital of Troy, actually, Ilium or Ilios. It's built at the same time as the last phase of Atlantis, by the way, about 3,500 years ago. So you had these enormously fortified walls with these great watchtowers. You're talking about really a rather paranoid people. The greedier they get, the more prosperous they become, the more enemies they have, and sometimes they do, or they think they have, and so the more they have to flex their military might, the more military expenditures are needed to guard all the wealth behind the walls. This is a drawing that was done, a sketch of Atlantis to give you some idea also. The Atlanteans were very big into horses. They were known as famous horse breakers. This was also part of their military thinking, but they were great horsemen. You can see some examples of the horse races, which were very popular. The Roman Circus Curiae of the Romans was a direct descent from this concept, by the way. It was carried to Rome by survivors of Atlantis, or carried to Italy, rather, before Rome began, by survivors of Atlantis. This is a rather idealized portrait, but will give you some idea of what the Atlanteans were as superb agriculturalists. They were living in an extremely temperate area, as I mentioned. The soil was uncommonly rich, fertile because of its volcanic nature, and they excelled in terrace farming. And their irrigational skills were unexampled. You see some of this carried over with the Incas of Peru, who talk about their ancestors, the Ayamari, coming from the sunken land across the Sunrise Sea, teaching the native peoples of Peru the finesse and high technology of terrace farming. It's another idealized and over-idealized portrait, but give you, again, some idea of what it was like. You could go everywhere in Atlantis by boat. Very maritime people. These temples were expressions originally at first of a very high level of spirituality, then degenerated into cult egotism. All of the land rings that I mentioned were accessible not only by canals but by bridges, footbridges. And the footbridges were magnificent works of art where you had statues of all the gods and the goddesses. So you'd walk along here and you walk through tremendous archways. The Atlanteans were also very big in gardening. I suggest that if you want to read about Atlantean gardening, there's a section in Homer in the Odyssey where he talks about Odysseus going to the land of Calypso. And the parallels with Plato's Atlantis are so obvious you don't have to stretch them, but wonderful detail on gardening. And underneath the bridges, ships had access also. Again, this is an example of a military contingency. Let's see, get this to work. They had subterranean channels that would connect. These would be for the military vessels only, not for freighters and so forth. This is an interesting design that was done by a gentleman by the name of Stale about 20 years ago. He's an architect who took all of Plato's details in his two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, that were written about 2,300 some years ago, and made architectural renderings of all of these details. And one of them that he came up with was this Victor's Temple. This is interesting, this symbol here, this is regarded as the national emblem of Atlantis. Circles within circles, obviously, this target sign symbolizing the concentric outlay of the city of Atlantis itself. This is a very famous place in Egypt. That's the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. Was made about 1500 BC. This is where a number of tourists were massacred a couple of years ago. Still is a rather dangerous place to visit. Hopefully not so much anymore. But the reason I single this out is because this particular temple was built by the great Queen of Egypt, was built to resemble a non-Egyptian temple that was visited during an expedition that she launched sometime in the 16th century or early 15th century, late 15th century BC, to a place called the land of Punt. It is now understood that Punt is not the name of a specific place, but is the name of the expedition itself. And this expedition, some said, went to Somalia or went to the Red Sea, but it now appears that this Egyptian expedition circumnavigated Africa. And that was a pharaoh later by the name of Necho who tried to reproduce Queen Hatshepsut's great expedition around Africa. And one of the lands that they went to had buildings like this, which are extremely non-Egyptian. This is not a typical Egyptian architecture by any means. It's the most unique structure probably in all of ancient Egypt today. And it was fashioned after this land that they visited which appears to have been Atlantis. It resembles Atlantean architecture. It's on a monumental, clean scale. This is what is known as an Etruscan temple. Now, the Etruscans were a great pre-Roman people who inhabited western Italy from about 1200 BC, the time that Atlantis was destroyed, until they were absorbed sometime around the time of Christ, although politically they had lost ground before then. And they built temples like this. This is a reproduction just found in the Roman Museum today, very accurately reconstructed, which also seems to reflect Atlantean architectural norms. Because the Etruscans were a people who had the tradition of having come from this destroyed island civilization. Let's see here. This is an idealized portrait, perhaps. It's kind of interesting here. The gentleman here is shown in a kind of a purple robe. Plato tells us in his account that the Atlanteans excelled in purple dyeing, that they were famous for the beautiful robes, beautiful blue and purple robes that they dyed. Well, that's interesting because there is a shell, the Purpur murex shell, which is found in abundance in the Canary Islands, in Madeira, and the Azores, and all the Atlantic islands from which they made this old dye. And so that fits their realm also. Going wrong. Let's see if I can fix this here. This is another idealized drawing, but it's not that overly idealized, of Atlantis in its last days. Here would be the Temple of Poseidon. This is the central island, as it were. This would be the next to innermost ring occupied by the aristocracy, the military and spiritual leaders of the country. And this would be the residence of the imperial family. This is an overview from Mr. Stale, the architect that I mentioned, of the innermost island. Here would be the water ring, the bridges, access to it. This is the Temple of Poseidon. He doesn't include here, though, the imperial palace. I think we have some kind of a rendition of that later on. The Temple of Poseidon is described as domed, and inside was a representation, a statue of the sea god. Now, Poseidon is a really interesting god for them to have worshipped, because he represents not only the sea, the power of the sea, but also of the human unconscious. Just as the sea itself on the surface looks calm, you see what's going on there, but beneath are all these animal energies at work. And so the same was taken in an esoteric sense for the symbolism of Poseidon. There we go. This is a classical statue of the god that was taken from the Aegean Sea. This is in the Athens Museum. He was originally holding a trident. And in this particular pose, this is in his aggressive military pose, fighting for the Atlanteans, as it were. So he was also a kind of a war god, especially in the end. Oh, sorry to get this backwards here. I think we're going all right now. Nope. Yeah, my reverse here seems to be stuck. I apologize for that. Yeah, I think I got it forward now, I hope. almost like a movie here. Yeah. Now this would be what the inside of the temple would be like. It would, Plato describes it as this great colossus of the god in his chariot, pulled by horses through the sea. This is a beautiful painting from an old-time life book on Atlantis. And this is probably a very accurate representation of the Holy of Holies, the spiritual center of Atlantis at its highlight. These 10 purple-robed figures represent each of the 10 kings of Atlantis that Plato talks about. Atlantis was a kind of an imperial confederacy. There was one emperor who had charge over everything, but on one day of the year, all of the emperors would meet in Atlantis, according to Plato, to vote on laws and to dole out judgments on an equal basis. Now, there you see them here sitting at a pool. Well, that's interesting because the pool was used for scrying. Don't forget that this was not only a very serious political and military power, but a very highly developed spiritual people as well. And so in their consultations, which dealt with the real world, as we would call it, the material world, they also accessed that spiritual aspect of themselves. So scrying would be if you looked into a piece of pure crystal or pure water to achieve an altered state of consciousness, that point, that still point in meditation that we strive for. That was the purpose of this particular pool. Here is the sea god Poseidon astride in his chariot, and these figures around here are very interesting. They're known as Nereids. You don't see them too clearly. They're boys on dolphins. You've probably seen that before. What does that mean? You know, what's the idea of having children on dolphins? It's supposed to represent a rapport. Perhaps a communication might be too strong a word, but a spiritual rapport between mankind and the animal world. And the reason why that was achieved was not just because it was a great thing to do, but because when human beings interface in a deep rapport with the animal world, it is a spiritual boost, a spiritual power. Some of that has survived amongst the Hopi Indians of the Southwest. They have what you've probably seen or heard of as the snake dance, where some of their priests go through a series of very complex rituals to get themselves into an altered state of consciousness, and they pick up these wild, fat rattlesnakes, put them in their mouths, and dance around the area for about half an hour, 20 minutes, with these snakes hanging from their jaws. And these Indian medicine men, as they're called, are rarely bitten, virtually never bitten. And the reason why, they will tell you, is that even a low creature as a rattlesnake, not noted for its intelligence, somehow knows in its consciousness that the Indian medicine man the Hopi has achieved a certain common level with that animal. And that's why it is peaceful and why they can work with it. And the reason why they do that is not to show off or show how powerful they are. It is a psychological, spiritual boost. It's part of the empowerment of the medicine man. And that concept is traced directly back to the Nereids that went around Poseidon, who I said is not only the god of the sea, but the god of the unconscious and everything that the subconscious is capable of doing. Atlantis was the same as our spirituality today or our religions today. It has the outer manifestations and it has the inner truths. It's the esoteric and the exoteric. This will give you an idea of the extent of Atlantis at its uttermost in its imperial period. Here would be Atlantis. And I'll show you why there's geologic evidence now to show why we know it is there. Each one of these different names are mentioned by Plato in his Critias and have been able to be associated with specific geographical locations as they were known in ancient times. So we now know that the kings that Plato is talking about are in fact the colonies or part of the confederation that the Atlanteans set up through the Atlantic world. So you see here as far as Yucatan and in Colombia, give you an idea how this works. One example, I can't take time to do all 10 of them, is Uaman. Uaman, according to Plato, was one of the 10 kings of Atlantis. We associate it with Ireland for this particular reason. In the Lea Fayal, which is the old book of invasions, it's called, it's the old stories of pre-Celtic Ireland, which are preserved today. And in this collection of old Irish stories, they talk about a sea people who arrive in Ireland after a great disaster at sea. And they are led, their leader is called Ahriman, so it's not very far from the Greek Uaman. Another example, I will just to give these two, is Eleusippos. Plato said that Eleusippos was a king of Atlantis, one of the kings of Atlantis. Eleusippos is associated with the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. Lisbon is a corruption of the earlier name that it was known as, which was Eleusippos, which was carried over by the Phoenicians. So this was the extent that the Atlanteans had about 1200 or 1500 BC. This is give you an example of what the Atlanteans looked like. This is a terracotta statue from the Etruscans in western Italy. This was made in the early part of the Etruscan civilization, and it fits in with descriptions found literally around the world of what the Atlanteans looked like. They had rather oval faces, slightly slanted eyes. There is evidence of red pigment. The Atlanteans were noted for being red-haired, not exclusively, but many of them were red-haired. Now, what's interesting about that is that this type of ruddy complexion and slanted eyes are associated with the people who have lived for a long time close to the sea, so it fits genetically. This man is a Basque, and the Basque have marvelous traditions of being the direct descendants from what they call the Lost Green Isle. And in their language, it is pronounced Atlantica. They say that their ancestors brought the tenets of their old pre-Christian religion from the Green Isle, where these tenets were developed, corrupted. The island was punished by God. The few people that survived were the holders of these tenets, and they brought them to the Pyrenees, to the Bay of Biscay, and they're carried on in the Basque people today. Now, what's interesting is if you compare the face of this man here to other examples of people we believe are descendants of Atlantis, the same basic characteristics, the aquiline features, the ovid face, the slightly slanted eyes. This is another marvelous feature, rather terracotta, that was found in Spain. This is called the Lady of Elche, because she's found in a little, outside of a little Phoenician town, old Phoenician town. And what's remarkable about this is that this terracotta has been dated to about 1500 BC, the height of the Atlantean power. Her costume resembles nothing that is known in Iberian or Spanish civilization, or Phoenician, or Roman, or Greek, anything that's known at all. But what's interesting about her is that, again, her facial features, again, generally conform to what we believe represent the Atlantean genotype, or racial type. By the way, the woman that excavated this, Alan Wishaw, back in the 1920s, wrote a book called Atlantis in Andalusia. She was the excavator who found this particular object and was able to connect it through local stories of Atlantis. This is probably the only portrait, the only profile surviving of someone from Atlantis, and this is why we believe it is. This you can see today in Egypt. It is a place called Medinet Habu. Medinet Habu means the victory temple of Ramses III. Ramses III was possibly the last of the great Egyptian pharaohs. And in 1198 BC, when he was crowned pharaoh, there were terrible omens all over Egypt. Great clouds of ash were coming over the Egyptian land from the west. And his records, his temple records about his coronation say men walk around as though they were gem birds, crows. They cannot keep their linen clean because all this ash that is going on. A few years later, after he had been installed as pharaoh, he was challenged by the greatest military threat that Egypt had ever had up to that time. She was invaded by a huge naval force of what is known as the Sea Peoples, a very mysterious, unknown people who don't know where they came from. The archaeologists don't know where they came from. They're called the Sea Peoples, and there were some like 50,000 of these Marines, highly equipped with bronze weapons, huge battleships called Bayar, much bigger than anything the Egyptians had, invaded the Nile Delta. They swept aside the Egyptian navy, no problem. They invaded almost the first third of Egypt, conquered it, no problem at all. But Ramses III was a very brilliant general. He lured these invaders down the Nile. And he knew the Nile better than they did. And so he would have his smaller Egyptian battleships, warships, taunt these invaders and outmaneuver them until the invaders got stuck on sandbars. When the ships were stuck, Ramses III brought over his troops of archers, and the Egyptian archers were the best in the ancient world at that time. He would brought over literally troops of these archers on the Nile bank, and they massacred the invaders. And they were the few that were able to survive were lucky. Those that were captured were represented on the walls of Medinet Habu, or this victory temple that Ramses III erected to this tremendous victory. He is the savior of dynastic Egypt at that time. And on the walls, he had the people that he captured. These are the men that he captured. Now, not only were they captured, but they also gave their testimony, which is still on the walls of Medinet Habu. And the Egyptians asked them, "Where did you come from? Why did you invade Egypt? We knew nothing about you." And they refer to these people as the Meshwesh, or sometimes the Weshesh, which means the people from the sea, or the sea people. And they say, well, we came from the island of Neteru. Of course, this is everything through an Egyptian filter now. The Isle of Neteru means the island of the gods, or an island that is highly favored. And they said, we came from the island of Neteru, which is beyond the 12th bow. Apparently, the Egyptians had a mapping system that used longitude like bows, semicircles. And beyond the 12th bow would be beyond the Mediterranean Sea. They said, well, we attacked Egypt because our land, the Isle of Neteru, was punished by the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet was the goddess of fiery destruction and flood. And they said, Sekhmet set our island on fire and pushed it beneath the sea. Our navy was left, and we thought we'd try one more gamble, and we tried to take over Egypt. And so this testimony can still be read, is still translated by the University of Chicago, not much publicized, and this represents one of the captives who told the Egyptian bureaucrats this story. Thank you. I have 5 minutes, I'm told, so I have not much time here. This is Ramses III, the savior of Egypt. I'm going to go fast here. This is his victory temple, still in great shape today, is the best preserved of all the major temples. Even some of the paint is still left. You can go there and see it yourself. Oh, there we go. This is a reconstruction of that beautiful temple at the Milwaukee Public Museum. This is when it was being made. The entire temple was covered with beautiful painted hieroglyphs. Let me see here. This represents the battle between the Egyptians and the invading sea people, the Meshwesh. And this tells, I haven't got much time to do this. This is a very famous place in Luxor, of course, in which on the walls are inscribed a treaty between Ramses III's predecessor, Ramses II, and the Hittite emperor. The Hittites were the great Soviet Union of its day, and they made a pact against the sea people. So we're seeing that even exemplified there. I think I'll speed it up to one last thing. This is the way we believe that Atlantis was geologically destroyed. Now, how could an island disappear under the water? How could such a thing happen? Has anything like that happened before? Yes, it has. One way for a volcano to erupt is called a composite volcanic eruption, where it erupts straight up. It would be like Krakatoa. You've all heard of that. It's blue sky high. Another famous volcano you heard of, though, is Mount St. Helens. That is known as a lateral volcano. What happened was that the volcano blew out its side, didn't it? It opened itself up. Now imagine Mount St. Helens was in the sea instead of on dry land. When it would blow out laterally, an unthinkable amount of tons of water would enter the magma chambers. What would happen then is a process known as subduction, instant subduction. If Mount St. Helens was surrounded by water instead of by dry land, it would have literally sucked itself under the water. This is, in fact, a lateral volcano going off, the Stromboli volcano in Italy, going off. And this is what we believe is the geologic mechanism for that. Well, unfortunately, I don't have time to finish up. Thank you very much. If you have any questions for me, you can see me at my booth back there, or you can see me at the workshop at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.